Well, good evening, everyone. Whether you're joining us here in person or from somewhere across land and sea virtually, my name is Dr. Dan Smith, and I am Vice President Academic and Dean of the Faculty of Theology here at Huron University. I'm very pleased to welcome you to this very special international conference on zakat, implementation and impact in the contemporary world. Before I say anything more, I would like to acknowledge that Huron University is located on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenapewauk, and Chinongton nations on lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties of 1796 and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors within our society. Huron College, as we were originally known, was founded in 1863 as a local training school for Christian priests in the Anglican tradition. Looking back, we can now see the complicity of our founders in the colonizing agenda of the British Empire, but we can't fault them for their commitment to their religious tradition. Nowadays, the majority of Huron's 2,000 or so students do not study theology, but instead take undergraduate programs in management and organizational studies, governance, leadership, and ethics, or in one of many other areas of study in the arts and social sciences. I know that Huron's current commitment to shape our students as leaders with heart, that is, people who are committed to making a positive difference in this world. This commitment is very much in keeping with the original vision of our founders. The Faculty of Theology has as one of its goals to contribute to Huron's rich academic preparation in the liberal arts through our undergraduate course offerings in religious studies. After all, how can you understand this world and its people and the way they relate to one another unless you also understand religion? Huron also offers professional master's programs in theology, as well as a research Master of Arts degree in theology. At all levels of study, we offer courses and programs in Islamic studies, including scripture, history, theology, and ethics, as well as modern and Quranic Arabic. And in our MTS program, we also offer training in spiritual care for Muslim community contexts. Our programs in Islamic studies have grown considerably since the London and Windsor Communities Chair in Islamic Studies was founded in 2011, and since Dr. Ingrid Mattson joined us in 2012. This growth has taken place thanks to strong community support, as well as Dr. Mattson's passion and leadership. Just a few years ago, Huron founded its Center for Islamic Theology, Ethics, and Spirituality, also known as CITES. CITES was founded with several goals in mind. First, to coordinate Islamic studies at all levels within the Faculty of Theology at Huron. Second, to organize annual lectures and other community events and academic programming exploring current topics in Islamic theology and ethics. Third, to support spiritual care for students. And finally, to facilitate dialogue and learning among Muslims and other faith and spiritual traditions. Thanks to significant donor support, CITES has been able to provide Islamic spiritual care for Muslim students, fund annual lectures, as I mentioned, on topics of academic and community interest, and establish both need and merit-based student scholarships, including brand new academic awards that recognize student excellence in several different areas of Islamic studies. On behalf of Huron, I'd like to express my sincere gratitude to everyone who's given to support the work of CITES. But one of the center's strongest and most faithful supporters is Dr. Yaqub Mirza, who is joining us on screen this evening. Dr. Mirza, hello.
Hi.
Dr. Mirza is president of the Center for Islam in the Contemporary World at Shenandoah University. And it's thanks to Dr. Mirza that we have been able to offer the Barzinji Mirza annual lecture. And it is thanks also to his generous support that this conference on zakat is able to take place. As the author of 5 Pillars of Prosperity, Essentials of Faith-Based Wealth Building, it's clear that the subject matter of this conference is very close to Dr. Mirza's heart. And what an impressive lineup for this conference. When I looked over the list of speakers, sessions, and topics, I was very impressed to see how deeply rooted this conference is in the lived experience of faithful Muslims in diverse contexts around the world. After all, the real work of theology is to draw from the deep resources of our traditions to inspire practice that respects context as well as tradition. And so I'm delighted that Huron University, the Faculty of Theology, and the Center for Islamic Theology, Ethics, and Spirituality are able to host this international conference. I'm also delighted to introduce to you Dr. Yaqub Mirza, who is joining us virtually and will now offer his own words of welcome and introduction. Dr. Mirza.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dr. Smith. Assalamu alaikum. Good evening. I'm really honored to be introduced by you, and it's such a kind words. You know, I often say that my initials are MYM, which basically means managing your money. So if you ever forget that, that's what I'm known for, managing your money. I want to thank Dr. Madsen, all the speakers, and the staff for organizing this conference. Dr. Madsen, we are highly impressed with your scholarly work and academic achievements and feel privileged to continue to work with you and Huron University College at Western University. If you agree, and I hope you do, please discuss areas of further cooperation and follow up to this conference with Dr. Irman and Dr. Yunus of both CSCW. Now, talking about zakat, which is a very dear subject to me, you know, I just want to say that we always give credit to God. We always say, Alhamdulillah. Now is the time to give some money, some cash. As you know, zakat is third pillar of our Islamic faith, and it is the only pillar in which we have to touch someone else. We just cannot do it ourselves. We have to reach out, and there has to be a second person involved. We can pray on our own, we can fast on our own, we can go to Hajj, but this particular one, we have to have another person who is a recipient, or one could be a recipient as well. Zakah in some way is like tithing. It is the most important aspect, yet perhaps the least misunderstood. Its relevance to North American context needs to be clarified. Hence this conference. There are many issues which I do not understand. I need your help to understand. And these are my thoughts. You may have other views, and I welcome to hear those views throughout the conference. The purpose of zakah is to eliminate poverty and provide a decent standard of living for every human being. Muhammad Ali Hashimi comments, the purpose of zakah is not to give poor person a few dollars to keep him going, but rather the purpose is to help the poor person attain a suitable, dignified standard of living, one that is befitting to the man whom Allah has honored and appointed as a vicegerent on earth, without either extravagance or stinginess. But you would say that, well, let's look around. It hasn't happened that. We see poverty all around. Question comes, why is that? Is it because of the percentages are so low? Or is it that we don't distribute zakah, we don't calculate it properly, we don't collect properly, and so on and so forth? Now, historically, it has been documented where we once lived in a time when Muslims seeking to pay zakah could not find anyone who qualified to receive tithing. A person would set out to pay zakah during the time of Umar bin Abdul Aziz, but could not find anyone eligible to accept it. So this means that the zakah can eliminate poverty and can have a dignified society where no one is in need. So why is that happening? So in my book, I talk about chapter 5. I talk about, by the way, this book is available free download on CSCW website, and second edition will be coming out soon. So I made a rough calculation that how much tithing or zakah has been collected. My numbers are, some would argue that it can be 12%, 8%. So my feeling is that 10% of the zakah, which should be collected or received from a community, is what we are receiving. So I feel that every Muslim, every person of faith wants to pay zakah or tithing, and want to calculate accurately based on the percentages and distribute it, then we can eliminate poverty. But it's not happening. So the challenge is to educate and find ways to calculate, collect, and distribute zakah so we can eliminate poverty and needs of the community. Now, some of the things which needs to be defined, and that will be the mission of this conference and the follow-up which we will have with Dr. Madsen, like nisab. Nisab is a concept which is not that much known, but many people know about it. So if you Google to find out what is nisab, for Canada it talks about $651. For US it talks about $487. Now, as you think of it, every person has this kind of money. So that means no one will qualify to receive zakah, because nisab is the required amount. If somebody has it, they cannot receive zakah. But if somebody doesn't have it, then they can receive zakah. And if somebody has more than nisab, then they need to pay zakah. So nisab is based on amount of wealth or income that family needs to live simple but decent life for 1 year. So that is the definition which some scholars have put together, and it makes more sense that you have something which is enough for you to live for 1 year. Why 1 year? Because the zakat is due after 1 year. So nisab encompasses essential commodities and services such as food, clothing, housing, education, medication, vehicles, and the tools of trade or profession. Thus, the nisab is an accurate and equitable basis for determining a sufficiency's limit. Now, most people, or many, or some, will say that zakat is distributed to poor and the needy. And that's a commonly known factor. But we often overlook the next 6 categories, which talks about other areas. Like the very next category, the third category, is that zakah administrators should be paid from the collection of zakah, because they are giving time, they are working for collection of zakah, distributing it or accounting it and everything. Now, just ask the question, how many mosques do you know which has employed full-time zakah collectors? Then often question comes, well, what is the reasonable overhead? Is it 10%? Is it 20%? Is it 30%? Some organizations go even higher. And some organizations, which are feeder organizations, they take 10% to 20%, and then they give out zakat to another organization. They also tag on their overheads. So at the end, zakah, which is actually goes to the recipient, is very little money. The next category, we talked about the debtors. How do we define debt? Is credit card debts is a debt? Is mortgage, student loan, a debt that can involve real property, money, services, at short sales or margin. If you lose money on margin in the stock market, it becomes the debt. Is that debt? Zakat can be used. You don't have to borrow money and buy stocks and short. So debt needs to be defined, and I am seeking help from all of you to say what is a debt, which Islamically what is mentioned in Quran and is acceptable debt. Captives, those who are held in bondage. A person, is it applicable to animals whose ability to move or act freely is restricted by confinement in a space? Can we use zakat money to free them? Can we use zakat money to feed animals which are in captivity? And so on and so forth. Can I use the zakat money to hire an attorney or hire a lobbyist or political campaign to help that person to come out of captivity? Now, interestingly, I look at it. Quran says that Prophet Muhammad SAW is a mercy to the world. He lived not only for himself but for others. Prophet, all creatures will be gathered on the day of judgment, beasts, animals, and the birds. That's the way Maqasidi approach is defined by Jasser Auda. Ultimately means that everything that has a name possesses life and awareness, the Islamic concept of life and awareness. So can zakat be used for these purposes? Because if we are to use for human being, can it be used for animals? Can it be for all creatures? Can I use zakat money to buy feed for animals? Planting plants and planting seeds is highly recommended. Can I buy seedlings from zakat money to plant trees, which will come to, give fruit or whatever, shadow in 30 years or so, and other natural resources? Can any of the categories of zakat defined in the Quran can cover these? Now, travelers in need, people who are stranded, seems to be obvious. After 9/11, we began requiring, or zakat givers start requiring, that people have to be legally either land immigrants or citizen of the country to comply with the new laws. We want to be more careful than what it is. Now, I find this contradicts a verse in the Quran about zakat. That is, that people who are stranded, who are travelers, who lost their contact in place. An example I can offer is that Kuwaitis traveled to Saudi Arabia when Kuwait was taken over by Iraq. They had no money to buy even the gas for their car. And our Saudi brethren, they use zakat money to feed them, to host them, and to treat them as guests. I wonder if they had to ask them, show us your citizenship card or immigration card, how will they feel about it? We always talk about, can we give zakat to non-Muslims? In my little research, which I will talk about tomorrow, there's no verse in Quran or Hadith which says that we cannot give zakah to non-Muslims. The only condition is that if the non-Muslims are fighting with Muslims and Islam, then obviously you don't want to empower them, give them resources to fight with you more. I feel that people who are distributing zakah are really not fully understanding the concept of zakah, and they perhaps need to be trained, and they need to be there can be a certificate specializing offering zakah, and this can be done through IIUPUI. They have very good school of philanthropy, and I've talked to them, and they're willing to offer such a course. So very quickly, I see Dr. Madison is seated to tell me I should get off. So task ahead is that we want to survey the landscape, look at the materials which are available, commission new research if needed, prepare a sample intake application form that balances the required information, define a SAP. The Zakat committee should take the online courses, list best practices about zakat, share the information with different masajid so a recipient can be helped. We should not treat recipient like criminals. They are in need and they have the right in our wealth, and we need to be dealing with them very patiently and being very compassion. So the challenge is to develop the appropriate material, educate, and find the ways to collect and calculate and distribute zakat. Lastly, I have to end with the story. Two people were stranded on an island. One was very worried. Other one was not worried and enjoying the beach. So the one who was worried, he asked, why are you not worried? He said, I make good money. I pay my zakat. I pay my sadaqah to the masjid. And if they don't receive my money, they're going to come and find me. So I'm not. Thank you so much. Enjoy the conference. And I will be available for any questions later or tomorrow. Thank you so much, Dr. Ingrid. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Dr. Yaqub. Thank you. All right, Bismillah. That was a very good start. And I want to thank both Dean Dan Smith and Dr. Yaqub Mirza, who's coming to us from Virginia, for us starting us with a lot of heart and mercy and blessings. And once my co-creators for this conference finish their very quick meal after having been delayed for 4 hours in the airport today, so I'm very grateful to them for coming here. I'll be introducing them, but now I would like to introduce the next speaker. And as you know, the Muslim community globally is diverse. We are across the world in different nations. We come from different linguistic, cultural groups. Some of us live in countries where we're the majority. Some of us live in countries where we are a small minority. We have men, we have women. And within the family of Islam, we have a number of different schools of thought. And in this conference, most of the presentations, or some of them, are coming from an analysis of or a presentation of the perspective of the Sunni school of thought, and I will be presenting after our next speaker. But we also have in our community a number of schools within the Shi'i tradition, and the largest of those is the Jafari Shi'i tradition, which is the most similar to Sunni Muslims in terms of thought and practice, forms of interpretation. And we're really very blessed tonight to have a scholar who is from that tradition who's joining us. It is Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi, who is the principal director of the Shia Research Institute in Toronto. He has authored and translated over 15 publications, including an explanatory translation of the Quran in 6 volumes, mashallah, Making an Islamic Will and Business Ethics in Islam. He has studied Islam at the Hawza al-Ilmiya and holds an MA in history from Simon Fraser University. And I spent a few hours watching on YouTube his really excellent videos explaining khums in the Shia tradition, which I'm not familiar with because it's not a practice that Sunni Muslims follow anymore for the most part. So please welcome our very honored guest, Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi, who will speak about zakat and khums in the Shi'i tradition. And if you just look straight ahead at the camera, where that, like at the back, that's where the people online will be with us. And let me just give you, just so that you're in the full screen and you're taller than me. So we'll do it.
Okay.
Like that. Whoops, wrong way. There we go. Thank you, Bismillah.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'd like to begin with the Islamic greeting of peace and salam to everyone here. It's indeed a pleasure to be part of this very important conference on zakat, especially looking at the implications in the contemporary times. And I would like to thank Dr. Matheson and the Huron University for giving me the opportunity to talk about zakat and khums from the Shi'i tradition, especially looking at the North American context. So I'll try to actually, make it as fast as I can, because we're to finish in 20 minutes. Okay. Okay.
And then you have time for questions.
Okay, so what I would like to begin is first talk about the concept of zakat from the Shi'i tradition. We know that the concept of charity and philanthropy in Islam is symbolized by the term zakat. And it is a term which has occurred in the Quran 32 times. And out of that, 27 of them is the verses where zakat has been paired with salat. So you have these two terms occurring again and again. And some of our writers actually say zakat is ukhtu salat. It is the sister of salat. And so there is symbolism in that, because when we look at the concept of salat, which is the ritual prayers, that is actually the human-God relationship. And then when you look at the concept of zakat, this is a human-human relationship. And by bringing them again and again in the Quran, perhaps Almighty God would like to make us realize that in Islam, it's not only good to sufficient to please Him, He becomes pleased by pleasing fellow human beings. And so we see, even the do I use the clicker? I thought this was.
Oh, they'll move it forward.
Okay.
They'll move it forward.
Can you move on the
Yes.
slide, please? Yeah.
I guess we expected them to read your mind, but there
Okay.
we go.
Yeah, so we see, the concept is there that mal and, wealth basically is given to us not only for ourselves, but, even for helping those who are less fortunate. وَفِي أَمْوَالِهِمْ حَقٌّ لِلسَّائِلِ وَالْمَحْرُومِ, which means that in their wealth is the right for the beggar and the deprived. And so this is basically the, essential concept that we have for zakat. When we look at historically the management of zakat, during the early history of Islam, I would say probably for 4 centuries, this was the responsibility of the Muslim khilafats or the governments. They were administrating the zakat fund. And we saw even Dr. Yunus talked about this concept of al-amiluna alayha, means those who work for the zakat. They are also their pay comes from the collection of zakat itself. And so the way uh, Dr. Yunus mentioned it. I never thought about it. Then maybe we have a full-time, a couple of accountants in our center. So maybe we'll be looking at the possibility of including at least a portion of their salary from the zakat and sadaqah fund. Although I think, my community members wouldn't like that at all. They don't want any administrative charges to be taken out from the donations that we receive. But by 5th century, the role of government in administrating religious funds greatly diminished. And now, especially looking at our own context here in North America, as a Muslim minority, zakat has become more a individual, process, or even collectively it's done through the mosques and the Islamic centers. I think the most common form of that practice is known as zakatul fitr, which is paid on the day of Eid, the day of celebration at the end of the month of Ramadan. And this is administered mostly through the mosques and the Islamic centers in the western part of the world. Um, as far as the concept of zakat in Shi'i jurisprudence is concerned, I actually I'm thankful for this opportunity because there's kind of a misunderstanding that Shias don't believe in the concept of zakat. They only focus on khums. And I'd like to clarify that issue that in the Shi'i jurisprudence, zakat is, yes, indeed, one of the 5 pillars of Islamic teachings. And we basically, when we talk about the items on which zakat is wajib or obligatory, there are 9 items which I would classify that into 3 categories, beginning with C: coins, cattle, and crops. So when we talk about coins, we are talking about gold and silver coins. In cattle, cows, sheep, goats, and camel. And in crops, wheat, barley, dates, and raisin. Now, in the Shi'i tradition, when we talk about zakat in gold and silver, this is only applicable if the gold and silver is in form of coins and the coins which are in circulation. So that's a very important distinction to be kept in mind. And therefore, the Shi'i jurists do not apply zakat on bank notes. So paper money, there's no zakat on it from the Shi'i fiqh point of view. Of course, we are not alone here. I think Hanbali school is with us. According to the Hanbali scholars, they say that if you convert the gold and silver into, if you convert the banknotes into silver and gold, only then, zakat would become wajib on it. And then looking at the other 2 categories of cattle and crops, farming and husbandry. When these are very specific professions, and so Shias, let's say in India or Pakistan or Iran and Iraq, who are into this farming or husbandry, they would be eligible to pay zakat. But when I look at North America, I travel all over. I have not yet seen a Shia farmer, So this is where, So when you look at gold and silver, since it is not common these days to have coins which are in circulation, when you talk about farming and husbandry in North America, I haven't seen a Shia farmer. So on a practical level, zakat in its obligatory form has limited scope among the Shias in the West. It doesn't mean in other parts of the Muslim world where the Shias exist, it is not being practiced. However, that doesn't mean that we do not use the zakat in the general sense of charity in general, not as an obligation. We have sadaqah, we talk about fitra, we talk about fidya, which is actually, paying um, grain if a person is not able to fast because of a good reason, or kafara, which is a fine. Again, giving in grains to poor and needy if they are not able, if they did not fast without any excuse. And so these are very common things. But it doesn't mean that the Shias are free completely as far as paying charity from bank currencies and banknotes are concerned. This is where homes comes in, and that's what I would like to talk about it. Um, when it comes to homes, which is the again an important element in the Shi'i fiqh, and this is actually based on chapter 8 of the Quran, verse 41. And in the Shi'i fiqh, um, basically the homes applies on 7 items. You talk about profit in your business or surplus on an annual basis. So this would apply to everyone, people who live on salaries or those who have business. And then if you are into mines and minerals or precious stones obtained from the sea through diving, or treasures, land that is Zimmi kafir buys from a Muslim, spoils of war, and legitimate wealth which has been mixed with illegitimate, where the owner now cannot separate one from the other. One of the solutions would be you look at your total assets and then you pay homes to make it totally, kosher in a way. And so, uh, among the in the Sunni fuqaha, of course, homes mostly is related to only spoils of war, but there are other items also in that 7 list. I think one or two of there, where you will see that even some of the Sunni schools of jurisprudence, agree with that. But it's not that commonly, discussed. And basically, what it means is that, the most common use of homes would be for somebody who is in business, or even if they are, they survive on the salary of their work. They basically have to annually do the calculation, and when it comes to the profit that their business has, or whatever savings that they have from their income, this is where 20% of that, of saving and profit, is to be paid in homes. So probably that's more than 2.5% or 12% that uh, our respected scholar was talking about. And so it's not that the Shias, get away from paying; they actually have to pay probably even more. Now, how is the homes fund, managed? The Homs Fund is divided into 2 parts. One is known as Sahm Sada, share of the Sadat. Sadat is the plural for Sayyid. Now, in the Shi'i terminology, whether you are from South Asia or Afghanistan or Iran or even Iraq or Lebanon, this term is used for those whose ancestry goes back to Hashim, one of the ancestors of the Prophet. And that half of the homes is dedicated for the poor and the needy Hashimites, if I may use the term. In the Arab Sunni circle, instead of the term Sayyid, they use the word Al-Sharif, Al-Ashraf. That refers to the descendants of, the Hashim. So all those who are from Banu Hashim, if they are poor and needy, they will be held from one half of the homes. And the reason is that the descendants of Hashim, especially the descendants of the Prophet himself, they are prevented from using zakat or sadaqah. And this is not only the Shi'i perspective, even in the Sunni fiqh, all four schools actually say that somebody who is from the Hashemite line, they cannot use a zakat or a sadaqah. And then we very quickly go on to the other half of the khums, which is known as Sahm al-Imam, where we believe that that is the share of the Imam of our time, the successor of the Prophet, the 12th Imam. And during his occultation, it is to be given to the senior most Shia jurist. We call him Mushtahid or the Mufti. And or you give it to him, or you use it according to his permission for religious and charitable causes. You know, the Shia Isnashri communities, especially in the West, rely on Sahm al-Imam portion of the Khoms for many things, you know, building and maintaining their religious centers, full-time Islamic schools, propagation of the faith, relief of poverty among community members, supporting deserving students for their higher education, and many, many other, you know, charitable causes. But it's important that, you know, we can only do it that once the senior most mujtahid has allowed us to do that. That's the important point. Just a side, you know, point there. Uh, they would not allow us to use the entire Sahm al-Imam. Even that Sahm al-Imam, you know, maybe one third of it or half of it, they will say you can use in your own area. The other remaining has to go to the senior most mujtahid. This is how they maintain the independence of their seminaries, whether it's in Najaf in Iraq or Qum in Iran or some other secondary seminaries in other Shia parts of the world. Let me just take this opportunity to talk about this issue of you know, promoting the waqf model. I think, you know, all these funds that we have from religious dues, whether it's zakat or khums or sadaqah and other things, they are not sufficient for upkeep of the activities of our Islamic centers. And we heavily depend on generous donation from the community members. And this is where I've been talking about, you know, reviving this concept of waqf, you know, religious endowments. And interestingly, CRA allows us here as charities to keep 10% of our annual donation separately for endowment funds. And that is something, you know, we have to really work on it into so that we can have income generating, you know, source for our Islamic centers and our activities. I think my time is running out. So what I'll do is very quickly, um, just to point to that Dr. Yunus Mirza also mentioned, this issue of helping non-Muslims in this part of the world. You know, many people in the Muslim community do not realize that Islam does not prevent us to do that, especially when we look at the category of the recipients of zakat, which is in chapter 9 of the Quran. You know, the category is known as al-mu'allafatu qulubuhum. You know, those whose heart are to be brought closer to Islam and Muslims. That is the categories which allows us to, you know, be charitable towards non-Muslims who are not hostile or fighting against, you know, Islam. And although this category, I would like to make a point here that some of the early Shia jurists, as well as the Hanafi and Maliki schools, consider this category to be lapsed after the Prophet. But the majority of Shia jurists consider that to be still valid even after the demise of the Holy Prophet. And this has been a guideline for us in our communities where we have not only helped the Shia community members or the Sunni community members or even the and the non-Muslims in our localities in different ways, because we consider that, we have to, extend our mercy and compassion for all, not only our own community members. And so this is just a list of activities that we do as far as helping the non-Muslims in Canada is concerned in our own areas. And I think my time is over, and I thank you for listening to me. And if there are any questions, I'll be around to answer them.
Thank you so much. Okay, thank you so much. That was really just so interesting. And mashallah, as clear as that presentation was, really the YouTube presentations are also very clear with really very informative slides. So anyone who wants to learn more, but we'll have a few minutes at the end, God willing, to if anyone has some questions. My role here tonight, and I should introduce myself. I'm Ingrid Matson. I'm the London and Windsor Community Chair in Islamic Studies here in the Faculty of Theology at Huron. I'm also the Director of CITES, the Center for Islamic Theology, Ethics, and Spirituality. And it's really an honor to be here today with all of you. My role today is really, I wanted to just do a basic overview of zakat in the Sunni tradition, because I'm aware that some people don't have the whole picture. And I know that we have, in addition to those who are signed on with us, registered online, this program is also being streamed to YouTube on the CCIW platform. And CCIW is the Center for, Center for Islam in the Contemporary World, CICW. And so some people are watching it there, and they'll be able to continue to watch it after this conference is over, inshallah. So I think it's worthwhile doing a brief overview, and the rest of the conference we're going to be going with each panel and each presenter going in depth in one particular area. So let's just pull up, see what I have here on my slide. The next one, which is abracadabra. There we go. Okay. So the first thing I wanted to point out is that, yes, the term zakah or zakat occurs many times in the Quran, as we heard. Also sadaqah, and sadaqah is used in, scholars love to debate language and the semantic range of different terms, and whether, in what way does sadaqah relate to zakat? Are they just simply synonyms, or do they have different meanings? They do have different meanings, but what we know is that in the Islamic tradition, that terminology, technical terminology, developed over time. So in the early period, especially in the first century of Islam, there were all sorts of different terms in different areas of fiqh, of acts of worship, that were general or related, but did not become specific technical terms until later. So zakat and sadaqah were used interchangeably. The kind of zakat that I'm talking about here tonight is the kind that is specified in sadaqah as sadaqah. The sadaqah is only for the poor and the indigent, needy, and we will see the list soon. But what I want to say is that the zakat that we're talking about today here in this overview is the obligation that is annual and must be paid. And I translate zakat as wealth tax. Zakat is often translated in English and introduced as charity. So often people will say that there are 5 pillars to Islam, and one of them is charity, is to give in charity. I prefer to say to pay the wealth tax because I think it's more precise. And there are many forms of charity in Islam. Charity is encouraged. Charity can come in many different forms. It should be given, but to understand that zakat is a wealth tax indicates its nature and also the obligation. That in this case we're talking about something that is not voluntary, whether or not someone can force it, but from God, it's an obligation from God. If we can just go back to the other verses and the other slide. So what we see is that zakat is always, as Sheikh Muhammad or Sayyid Muhammad al-Rizvi said, tied very often in the Quran with prayer. This is what salah is, right? So zakat and salah. The wealth tax, pay the wealth tax and pray. This is really important. One thing I want to point out here in the verses that I have listed here, these are all from the same surah of the Quran, Tawbah, and follow each other. And between these verses, the emphasis in this section of the Quran and this section of the surah is about believers having to do things that are tough, that are sometimes difficult, whether that is giving from their money, whether that is standing up to defend their community. And what's really beautiful is that these collective obligations that we have to defend our community, to collect and distribute zakat, as well as other things, all of these collective obligations, we have to, there's no way other than to work together, discuss, argue, bring our best expertise together to understand how to do it in whatever context we're in. And that Allah specifically in the Quran, in the second, in the surah that I have there in the middle of this list, Surah Tawbah, verse 71, specifically says that this is a collective obligation of the believing men and the believing women. Women have their own wealth. Muslim women have their own wealth. They have a right to their own wealth. They own their own wealth. And they also are obligated, as believing men are, to pay from their own wealth and to work together to do what is right, including establish prayer, pay zakat, prevent what is wrong, and encourage or order what is right. And it is they upon whom Allah will shower his mercy or give his mercy. Ulaika sayarhamuhum Allah. And this is beautiful. We live in, times are always difficult. Maybe people always feel that their age and their era and their time is the most difficult. We feel that, and we know that we always need the mercy of God. So to understand how can we hope for that mercy? Well, we can always hope for the mercy, but what can we do in terms of our part? Certainly coming together to do this. So some basics about zakat. So zakat, as I show in the next slide, is an obligation on every believer, every believing man and woman. It depends if some people say it's also obligatory upon a minor or a child who meets the other conditions. Others disagree with that. The dominant position in Sunni Islam traditionally has been that it is obligatory upon the wealth of a minor, which makes it different from any other ritual obligation, which is only an obligation once someone reaches the age of majority, according to the moral accountability of a human being. They're mukallaf, so they have the moral accountability. So any Muslim who owns zakatable property for 1 lunar year whose value is above the nisab. So nisab is the minimum amount. And Dr. Mirza mentioned that in his discussion. How do we understand what nisab is? We know that there are all sorts of traditional formulations about how that should be done, but does that make sense? Does it meet the purposes today? And this conference is about outcomes and impact of zakat. Are we meeting the obligations? Are we hitting the mark? Are we meeting the objectives? And how, if we aren't, how do we do that without also violating specific orders that God has given us and directions, an example of the Prophet Muhammad. Next slide. Okay, so these are the 8 categories that you've heard about: the poor, the needy, those who administer them, the zakat, the alms, those whose hearts are to be reconciled, those in bondage, those in debt, in the path of God, and the wayfarer. So here is a specific list, and it's quite interesting because the Quran doesn't often give just lists, you know. More often, the Quran gives us principles about justice, about fairness, all sorts of things, gives us some specifics, but we don't usually find such a specific list. So this list must mean something. Nevertheless, we still have to interpret it. For example, there is a lot of discussion, well, what does it mean to be poor? What does it mean to be needy? Is need a relative feeling, or is it something objective that can be measured, and so would be the same for everyone? There's a lot of discussion about this in early Islamic fiqh texts, and all sorts of discussion about each of these categories, and that continues until today. There's also the question about whether there should be a balanced distribution among the categories. We have 8 categories. So is it necessary that zakat should be distributed in a balanced way so that no one category is overlooked or is not given its due or its merit? Is there a maximum amount of zakat that any person can be given? For example, should it be just enough to get them over the poverty line, or could you give enough zakat to a person to allow them to make a major purchase, like business tools so that they could set up their own business and then become independently, financially independent, pay for their education, a training, the whole cost of a training, or should it be enough just to meet basic needs? And all of these things are discussed. This is one of my favorite books, Kitab al-Amwal, by the early scholar, 2nd century scholar, Abu Ubaid al-Qasim ibn Salam, who was a scholar of the Quran, of the Arabic language, of hadith. And in this book, Kitab al-Amwal, is a beautiful overview of amwal as wealth, okay? So wealth or property in the Islamic tradition. And Abu Ubaid is often, sometimes he's considered a Shafi, but he really was before, or not, he wasn't really confined within any madhab at that time. And so he has a lot of original thinking. And in this passage, and I cite this in a paper that I wrote on many years ago, about 20 years ago, on need and status in distributing zakat, and also assessing nafaqah, which is the family maintenance. He has a very passionate argument or plea about, if you see someone who they're just struggling, I'm paraphrasing, but he basically says someone who's really struggling and they cannot support themselves and their family, and all they need is a certain tool or certain equipment, and they could set themselves up and become financially independent. Doesn't that meet the mark? Doesn't that make more sense? Or a man with a family, he has children and does not have shelter. Does it not make sense to give that man the ability to shelter him and his family, even though that particular amount that would allow him to do that would take him over by itself, right? Poverty. So what I love is in these early discussions is both a commitment and a fidelity to the Quran and to the Sunnah of the Prophet Muhammad, but also a real deep understanding that there's a reason for these orders, And we need to struggle, we need to work hard to understand how to meet the mark. So calculating zakat, again, what is subject to zakat? Gold, silver, cash, debts, business inventory, precious minerals, livestock, crops, whether they're irrigated or not. And of course, if you have livestock or crops, this is not, many people say, zakat is 2.5% of your wealth. Well, it's not really 2.5% of your wealth if you have livestock, right? It's calculated a different way. It's calculated a different way if you have crops that are irrigated or are dry farmed, meaning you don't do irrigation, you just depend on water. So, but because most of the way that zakat is discussed in our, so let's say, North American society, as Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi said, most people are just working, have a salary or a business. So these other categories, we don't, they're not relevant to us, so they aren't spoken about this way. But I think it's important that we take a little time to mention these differences, because otherwise, in our rush to kind of just make it, to simplify it, some people might not simply know that if they did decide to have a little farm, get some animals, begin to grow some things, they simply wouldn't even know how to calculate their zakat in that case. Salary, etc. So there are many discussions of these, of the forms and how they should be calculated, but especially in the contemporary, the modern economy. And that is something that we will be discussed tomorrow morning in the first session, God willing. Okay, when the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, sent one of his companions, Mu'adh bin Jabal, to lead Muslims in Yemen, he said, this is a very famous statement, he said, gave him an order for a number of things and then said, inform them that Allah obligates them to pay sadaqah from their wealth. Take it from their rich so that it can be returned to their poor. So they're rich, they're poor, returned to their poor. Now, this shows us that wealth is not, no one's a self-made man. I mean, obviously, all wealth comes from God, but in this world, wealth is also not just made by a person. Wealth comes from the community. And there are certain people, because of certain advantages they have, or they're a lot of initiative and energy, they accumulate a proportion of that wealth that puts them in excess. And this creates a gap between them, the wealth they hold, and the rest of the community. And so zakat is a necessary return of that surplus, of some of that surplus to the community. So there is an understanding that wealth is created by the community and within the community. And through zakat, this is a way for return. And this is a very different understanding of wealth than a capitalist, contemporary capitalist society has. So this is important to remember. The question is, in today's day, what does it mean to be our people? Or what does it mean to have local collection and distribution? It has always been a condition in the Sunni jurisprudence to have local distribution. But it gets complicated in today's time. How people live, they used to count houses, or they used to have specific units that made a neighborhood or a locality. It's very different today. And we live in a society where people are separated by their income, right? So in a pre-modern society, wherever you lived, you had lots of people who were living together, people of different incomes side by side, right? You could have a rich person, you could have someone who had very little. It's not the case as much. We try to plan our communities to be with people like ourselves. And so the gap that we see, the wealth gap and the gap in advantage and privilege in contemporary communities and cities today, can make it more difficult to really redistribute or return wealth locally, because a lot of people say, well, I don't know anyone who needs, I've heard people say, I don't know anyone who needs zakat. which shows that you probably have to get out of your neighborhood, and there are probably even people in your neighborhood who might need it. But also, what if your wealth comes from your business in another country? Say you live here, but you have factories in other countries, and the majority of your wealth is being generated in another country. What's your locality? Where does the return happen? And how do global supply chains affect our notion of local? One of the well-known contemporary commentators or interpreters of zakat is Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi, may Allah have mercy on him, who was a prominent Sunni scholar who spent a lot of time on this. This is a 2-volume work, Fiqh al-Zakat, the law of zakat, in which he delved, into many of these issues, specifically things like investment funds and property that's bought to just be investment properties that are left empty, just to basically hold the money that might not be subject to zakat according to the traditional scheme. But basically you could have someone who's sitting on $30 million worth of empty property who doesn't pay zakat. Meanwhile, some farmer with, five cows and 40 sheep is paying zakat. So there's something a little bit off there. So there has been a lot of discussion, and often the greatest discussion though has been in how to calculate it and what is zakatable and how to do that. So that's why we're less focusing on that in this conference and more on the distribution. Obviously, another area of great discussion is who should collect and distribute zakat. As we heard, traditionally it was the state, the ruler, but that did fall away after some time in most places. So the question is now, should it be the community? Should it be designated organizations? Should it be an individual directly? And how do any of these modes of distribution actually affect the zakat payer, right? If I'm writing a check, sending it away on my app, making a donation, or do I find someone? So how do these modes of distribution affect my relationship as a payer to zakat, but also to the zakat recipient? How is zakat received when it's given on a personal basis, through organizational professionals who maybe have training in social work and have another existing relationship with the people in need? There could be advantages or disadvantages of both. We know that very early in Islam, the first successor to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Abu Bakr, he considered the centralization of zakat so important that he considered those Arabian tribes who said, yeah, we're still Muslim, but we don't want to pay our zakat to you. He considered them to have actually left the Muslim community. So he understood that it was really important to have a central authority who would take it to redistribute it in a way according to the people who needed it with some judgment and wisdom. So is that something that we're paying enough attention to? Who is collecting it, and is there an overview? We hear that in the Shia tradition, there is a designated person. In the Sunni tradition, there isn't. So to what extent do we need to pay more attention to that? In the Muslim world today, you see all of the green countries are Muslim majority countries. Only a few, very few, less than a dozen collect zakat, have obligatory zakat collection. Others enable, others have government supervision of zakat collecting organizations, but in the vast majority, it's a completely voluntary activity. If we are collecting and distributing it ourselves, this is too small. You can maybe make this bigger, maybe do this full screen here, Muram. One of the things that we found here in North America, because there are so many different organizations, And as Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi said, communities do not like any of their zakat taken for administration. They really do not like that. And I think that's true of any organization, universities, institutions. They're always, well, what's the overhead, right? No one can understand why these organizations have to have so much overhead, whatever they consider to be much. And what we found is that there were emerging a few years ago a lot of complaints and accusations of wrongdoing, that some organizations were taking zakat and they were spending too much for overhead, or they were mixing the categories. There were organizations that were considering themselves both a zakat receiving organization as well as the administrator of the zakat. This was related to another project that I do, which is the Harmer Project, where we look into violations of trust within Muslim communities. And so we began receiving a lot of complaints about these issues. And it's the reason why we asked for one of the participants in our Harmer Project conference to write a paper on this. And Sheikh Yusuf Ali Wahb, who's presenting tomorrow, wrote this paper, The Use and Misuse of Zakat Funds by Religious Organizations in North America. You can find it on the online journal Religions. It's a very, very extremely detailed paper. And whether a person agrees with or disagrees with the different positions on how zakat should be used and administered and categorized and understood by the nonprofit organizations in North America, the reality is that if you lose the trust of the people, then this is the problem, right? And so how to maintain that trust through education, through transparency. Not everyone is going to agree. And our next panel, we're going to have some different individuals who have dealt with this issue of being a zakat receiving and distributing organization. How have they struggled with this? Certainly what we see is that people are really trying to understand in a very complex and different contemporary environment how to do it. And so that is our goal for today. And I believe that is, oh yes, I just thought I'd pull this up. If you can take that other screen off it, and maybe, I don't know if you can make it bigger, Maram, or not, but I was looking on the archives of the community of Imam Warthaddin Muhammad in the United States. As some of you may know, may Allah have mercy on him, Imam Warthaddin Muhammad brought the African American community who had embraced, been part of the Nation of Islam. After his father died, he brought this large community, many, many thousands of people into mainstream Islam. And one of these communities was this community of Daniel Muhammad in Mosque in Indiana. And this is just a newsletter. I was looking, this is a newsletter from 1982, and it has a few different announcements. Above where it's circled, it says, Sister Zarina is to be married. Grand announcement to follow. So that's nice. I hope she had a happy marriage. The Shura will sponsor a street fest from the 29th to the 30th. And Central, more to follow. Other nice news from this community. And the part that I circled says this: Zakat is the legislation of Allah Himself to be enforced by your own heart. Pay zakat and carry out your duty to Allah. And I just found that really moving, how that was conveyed. So we all hope to have that enforcement in our own heart, no matter how we conceive of it and think about the right way to do it. So thank you for your attention. Few points that might be made later in the conference, but I think this is enough today. I'll end it and just see if anyone has some questions for Sayyid Muhammad Rizvi, who I'll ask to come back up here in case someone has a question for you. So just, we have time for maybe just a couple of minutes. I don't know if that the chair or you can have that at this chair. Okay. Any questions or comments? And if there's some online, you can pull them up there, or anyone in the room, just raise your hand. Yes, Mahdia. Now apparently I have to put on a microphone here. Hold on. Room ceiling mic. Okay, yes. Please go ahead.
I just wanted to ask this question that homes in Shia then should be paid after the debt is taken into account, yes? Whatever is left at the end of the year.
Yeah, basically the term used is that the individuals have to fix an annual debt for themselves.
Yes.
So it's nothing fixed like Ramadan or the Hajj or Muharram or something. And so every year at that time they will see whatever they have spent from their income for themselves and their dependents, that's fine. But whatever remains at the end.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, that's an important question. Anyone else? Yes.
First of all, thank you both so much for all of the information. Thank you. I've learned so much. I wanted to ask on the point of zakat administrators, potentially, not for sure, because we know the committee is not like that, receiving a portion of zakat. Could we potentially read that as maybe a labor right imbued in Islam? Like, we see that as a right given to the administrators who are performing that sort of labor.
Zakat is your area.
No, I mean, it is interesting that I think this is why also I believe it's important to get terminology right. For example, to say wealth tax rather than just charity, is that there can be an idea, kind of bifurcation among North American Muslims of the sort of religious and then religious life or religious part of life and everything else. Almost as if anything having to do with religion is somehow it's all about voluntary. It's all about that if you have somehow money involved in it, it makes it less, taints it, or somehow makes it more part of the dunya. And that's just a misunderstanding of Islam, because there are so many, almost every aspect of our life is entangled with some form of wealth, whether it's the land that we live on, right? Whether it's how we relate, pay to each other, the maintenance in our family, what we buy, what we sell, all of these things. So to have this idea that when we're talking about zakat, which is this religious obligation, to have anyone to take any money to collect it seems somehow against the spirit of it. And that's just a misunderstanding of Islam. The same reason why, unfortunately, and I see we have some imams in this room, sometimes our community is, like, honestly, really terribly cheap about paying the spiritual leaders of our community and the religious teachers in our Islamic schools, as if because they're specializing in teaching religion or leading religion that they should do it for free. It doesn't really make any sense. I don't know how to get people quite out of this mindset. You must have a struggle with this at times.
Yeah. I think this issue of even the list we have in chapter 9 talks about those who collect. That would be more relevant if it was being governed by the government. So if we had a khilafat or an Islamic government, that makes sense. But individually, as far as my observation has been, people wouldn't give to a charity where a portion of the donation is being used for administration. They actually ask, what is the percentage of your donation which goes in overhead? And, we also hear from many non-Muslim charities also. Sometimes it is 50% or more. And so those questions come up. And I think at the moment, the way Muslims feel about it, they wouldn't be comfortable in using that fund for those who are in the business of running charities.
Thank you so much. But another thing, I mean, if I had time, I would have said more about this, which is that, of course, zakat is not the only form of, or the only means to create a fair and just society in Islam. There are specific prophetic teachings about paying people what we would now call a living wage, or supplying them with a living wage. There are rights to commonwealth, water, land, air, grazing rights, all of those that have been taken over and enclosed in the last few centuries, specifically after British colonization. More than anything, probably, I don't know what you would think about this, but probably the greatest thing any of us could do to relieve the cycles of poverty would be to eliminate riba, which is the only thing that God in the Quran, which is usury, the only thing that Allah in the Quran declares war on, those people who engage in usurious transactions. So imagine we're in a society where people are constantly being put into poverty and then falling deeper and deeper and deeper into poverty because they have these high interest bearing obligations. Imagine if that was lifted, then maybe zakat could really do its part in helping to close the gap.
Assalamu alaikum. I have so many questions, but I'm wondering amongst Shia jurists, like how much conversation is happening around thinking and rethinking towards the contemporary context? Are there people kind of pushing for new ways to think about these things?
Well, the majority and the of the senior jurists that we have, they still work with the Quran and the Sunnah of the Prophet as explained by the Imams of Ahlul Bayt. And so there is this concept of ijtihad among Shias. It is a living tradition. Like any Shia child who reaches to the age of maturity, they have to do taqleed of a living mujtahid or a jurist. They can't just follow somebody who lived 25 years ago. And this is where new issues come up. Solutions are sought for that, but they always turn back to, is there a guideline or even indirectly from the Quran or the seerah of the Prophet and the example of the Imam? So that's always the basis there. So if you're asking for whether there's a reform movement among, there are some very few individuals who think in that way. Like this whole issue of zakat, whether it can be applied on banknotes or not. They say this is wealth now, so you shouldn't say that only if it's in form of the gold and silver coins which are in circulation. But there are many arguments about it. One of the things is that President Nixon separated, gold reserve from the currency. Now it depends how many notes the U.S. Treasury wants to print. It's not tied to gold anymore. And so, there are different arguments in that way. So, but still, the mainstream, group of the Shia scholars, they look at new issues, but they try to find a solution from early sources.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. All right, this ends this panel. Thank you to all the questions. We'll take a 2-minute break while we set up for the next panel. Remember, start with yourself.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Welcome back from our little break. My name is Shaheen Pardhan, and I am one of the assistant professors here at Huron University College. I'm very excited that we are able to host all of you today. It's an honor to be part of an institution that has wonderful people like Dr. Matson who are able to arrange events like we have today. So I am here to introduce our speakers today. Do you want me to? Okay, so I'm going to start with Sister Tanvir Mirza. Sister Tanvir holds a medical degree from Karachi University and studied at the Graduate School of Islamic and Social Studies. She is the co-founder and president of the Faith for Appropriate, Immediate, and Temporary Help, Faith, Social Service, an organization principled on the efficient distribution of zakat and sadaqah, which has helped over 500,000 people. She is joining us online.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. My name is Tanvir Mirza. I'm the president of the Foundation of Appropriate, Immediate, and Temporary Help, a non-profit 501(c) social services organization in Herndon, Virginia, right outside of Washington, D.C. Let me tell you the story of the birth of faith. More than 25 years ago, Lutheran Social Services was bringing Bosnian refugees to our city in Virginia. We were invited to join as volunteers from our Islamic Center, that is Adams Center. The experience sparked an interest in a group of community members, including Imam Majid, Mohiuddin Atiyah, and myself, to start a Muslim organization dedicated to the principles of zakat and sadaqah and showing how this model can impact our community. Well, little did we know what challenges were awaiting us. First, we needed to learn the bureaucratic process of starting a nonprofit organization, such as registering our organization. Every year, we have an internal audit of our books. We file the tax return for nonprofits, that is 990. These were processes that were unfamiliar to many of us, but essential to establishing an organization in compliance with American laws and regulations. The next challenge was with our funders and how they viewed poverty. Most of our donors were students or immigrants from foreign countries. They were used to throwing a few pennies to the beggars on the streets of Muslim countries. When Faith did a huge food distribution and the needy came walking on bikes, sharing cars to get food, but they did not look very impoverished. The donors could not believe that there were people in need. Their concept was that beggars on the street were those who needed help. In most Muslim communities in the US, we do not see an adequate collection and distribution of zakat. The Quranic model is not followed. In fact, the zakat is not given much importance at all. The Muslims are suffering from poverty. They do not like to go to mosque to ask for help because their identity will be disclosed and they'll be treated very poorly. They are made to feel that they are lazy and are a thief or a cheat. On the other hand, some feel that the zakat money is theirs and must be handed to them with no questions and whatever they demand. This led us to study zakat in detail. What is zakat? What is sadaqah? What is just a plain charitable donation? What is the difference from one to the other? We came across several different cultural definitions and practices. For example, paying zakat if you want and whatever amount you choose, instead of it being obligatory and of definite amount. The other questions were, if a person gives tax, does she still have to pay zakat? What kind of wealth do we give zakat on? Is interest zakatable? How often do we give zakat on our earnings? These questions are still developing, and many of them and more will be answered by this conference of zakat scholars, inshallah. We look forward to their presentations and hope to add to our knowledge and practices. As we work to develop our model, Dr. Jamal Barzandi, rahmatullah alayh, of IIIT was our teacher regarding zakat. We learned from him a great deal about zakat collection and distribution. Additionally, Dr. Yaqub Mirza and Sterling Management stood by us in managing our endowment, making our investments, and we also have a scholarship endowment now. At Faith, zakat is like a raft. People who have fallen in the ocean are put on it. They have all the necessities of life, like food, etc. No luxuries we can provide them, no televisions, no biryanis. Their situation does not change, but they're surviving. They are not drowning, but still floating. Sadaqah comes along, tutors, teachers, mentors, and coaches surround the raft. They examine the skills and potential of the unfortunate people. Those who want to change this situation learn to row the boat of life. Alhamdulillah, they conquer their difficulties and become the hands that give. All our programs have zakat and sadaqah working hand in hand. Zakat is a fund restricted to 8 categories. It is used only to help people to survive. For instance, food, shelter, clothes, medical expenses, funerals. Whereas sadaqah is unrestricted to any work of khair, and we use it for the development of families, such as needs like education and our self-sufficiency programs, which includes training, scaffolding services, etc. The intake and assessment is very important to determine who is eligible for zakat and who is not. The federal poverty levels are helpful for this determination. There is seldom any hesitation from the clients to take zakat, as they are in desperate need of immediate assistance. The specific requirements of intake are fulfilled, like basic contact information, IDs, budget, income tax return, school lunches, food stamps. A determination is made if the family is below poverty according to the federal standards. The first stop is the emergency program, then referred to housing or children program or food pantry or thrift store, or all the programs at once. The biggest challenge we face is how to develop our clients so that they become financially stable and break the circle of poverty. The first step is ensuring their immediate needs are addressed. Zakat helps us to house them in 1 to 3 year programs. The second stage is empowering them. Sadaqah pays for their education or job skills development. Our local Muslim community has been of great help in providing jobs to our clients. They have mentored our clients, helped the children with school issues, and helped them write resumes. Volunteers of professional fields have come forward, like lawyers and teachers. We have been blessed with many successes. Many refugees, single parents, and very poor families have turned their lives around. Some of them have become first-time home owners. They have good paying jobs so that they can sustain themselves. The kids are top of their classes. We are looking at a brighter future. Please look at our brochure now, which will be handed out by my colleague and our Chief Operating Officer, Fakir Ahmed. Alhamdulillah, our programs have grown a lot. We do some very impactful programs with children and their families. Our emergency program, funded by Zakat, takes care of the survival needs of the families. We pay electricity bills as well as rent and medical bill assistance. Through our food pantry, we provide groceries. We also provide shopping vouchers to our thrift store. We have had clients call on us on the coldest days of the winter. Their heat had been shut off, and Faith was able to help them restore it. We also now have 11 housing units that have served as transitory housing for clients as they get on their feet. Also funded by Zakat, we have programs designated for the elderly and the handicapped. This can include monthly stipends. We support them through their lifetime and then provide for their janazah. Our children's program covers the basic needs of our youngest clients, from clothing to school supplies. Additionally, we do development programs such as field trips. This allows us to support these vulnerable children directly as we support their parents to become more stable. For each client, we assess their situation and combine support from our Zakat and Sadaqah programs. For instance, an individual could be in our rent assistance program and receive a scholarship for education. Development programs happen with Sadaqah money. The services of counseling and coaching and conflict resolution brings peace and harmony in the family. Domestic conflict and poverty is prevented and development is reassured. Let me share with you the story of a doctor refugee from Iraq and his wife, a young couple who came to us. The wife worked in the grocery store and became the manager. Husband passed all medical exams and got an internship in nephrology in Florida. They donated their entire household stuff to Faith. Zakat and Sadaqah are a wonderful means of helping our community grow. Subhanallah. At Faith, we have put into practice this two-tiered model of Zakat and Sadaqah, providing both the life raft and the oars for individuals to change the course of their lives. We prioritize human dignity and use these blessings of Zakat and Sadaqah to better our community. Thank you.
End. Our second speaker is Fagia Shafiq. She is the Chief Operating Officer at Islamic Relief Canada and a previous Chief Financial Officer. She has worked closely on the implementation of IRC's Zakat policy. Fagia holds a BBA and MACC degrees, as well as a CPA and CA designations. Prior to IRC, Fagia worked at Ernst & Young in professional services for 5 years. Please join me in welcoming Fagia.
Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah, everyone. I'm just going to start with a brief video. Promise it's only
Zakah
30
has
seconds.
the power to end extreme poverty. If the whole world gave zakah, it could end extreme poverty many times over. Islamic Relief has been distributing zakah for over 38 years. Our zakah policy complies with strict Sharia guidelines. It's endorsed by qualified scholars, and it only goes to eligible rights holders. So, harness the power of your zakah with Islamic Relief.
If anyone couldn't tell, that was developed by our British counterparts at Islamic Relief USA. So thank you to them for letting me take the video. Like Shaheen mentioned, my name is Fagia. I'm the COO at Islamic Relief Canada. Thank you to Dr. Ingrid and to Huron University for allowing us to be here today and to talk to you a little bit about our process, how we developed our policy, and more specifically, the challenges and the risks that we face when implementing our Zakat policy en masse in our global operations. Because as you can imagine, it's not that easy of a process. So in terms of what I'll be covering today, I'll start by just setting the stage, although I think Dr. Ingrid's talk did do that quite well. Give you a brief overview of who IR is in case you're not familiar with what we do, talk about how we developed our zakat policy, followed by some key areas of discussion, the actual challenges that we faced in terms of its implementation and continue to face on an ongoing basis, as well as some lessons learned, inshallah, and then obviously any questions that you may have. So to get started, setting the stage, I think Dr. Ingrid referred to a lot of this, but the world of today is very different than the world of our Prophet, peace be upon him. And really, our world is more connected than it has ever been before. In one day, you could drive a Japanese car, work on a laptop that's made in China, sit on a desk made in Sweden, and if you're me, hopefully enjoy some Pakistani mangoes, but in any one given day. But what that means is that our global economy and our understanding of what local means has significantly evolved. And the amount of funds, and zakat specifically, flowing from the global north to the global south is greater than ever before, including the number of organizations that are now collecting and distributing zakat. This is not just limited to Islamic organizations like Islamic Relief, Human Appeal, Human Concern International, and so on and so forth, but also non-Muslim organizations like the UNHCR, which now also offers zakat collecting services and distribute them in many areas around the world to serve humanitarian needs. So more so than ever before, there's strong collaboration required between the expertise of the humanitarian and development sector, as well as the scholars that truly understand the nuances of how zakat works, so that we can deliver the zakat and deliver our humanitarian work with ihsan, with excellence, and of course, in regulation with Sharia requirements. Now, several years ago, we started the process of developing our very own zakat policy. So I'll talk a little bit about that in a second, but I wanted to give a brief overview of who we are as an organization. Just a show of hands, how many of you are already familiar with Islamic Relief? It'll tell me how much I have to really dive in. Alhamdulillah. Well, wonderful. So in that case, I'll take a very brief moment. We're an international non-government organization that work in the humanitarian, sustainable development, and orphan sponsorship sector. In terms of our global reach, we do serve in over 40 countries, alhamdulillah. And just Islamic Relief Canada specifically, we're able to help over 4.3 million people last year in over 150 different projects, all through obviously the contributions and the generous donations of those that trust us with their funds. In terms of our emergency response, that includes everything from our response are obviously currently in Gaza, to the Pakistan floods, to the earthquake in Turkey, Syria last year, providing food, water, shelter, any sort of emergency giving. Our sustainable development programs can be anything related to water, long-term sustainable development. It can include livelihood, education, training, and our orphan sponsorship program is a one-to-one program between our donors as well as the orphans that they sponsor in those 40 countries, and it's a direct cash transfer program. Now, like I mentioned, we started the process many years ago, as you can see, in terms of developing our zakat policy. The process actually started almost 1 decade ago, where our implementing partner, Islamic Relief Worldwide, started consulting and engaging several scholars in the UK to help them establish a robust zakat policy. Prior to this, we were working with broad zakat guidelines, and of course, those kind of governed where we expended the funds, how we split them. But we recognized that in the sector, it was not yet normal to have a robust policy, and this was a gap that currently existed. So they started that process, and as you can see, it did take quite a while. IRW engaged several scholars in the UK in this process. They have a Sharia kind of Imam Council that they engaged, and there were many challenges in the development of this policy. First and foremost, of course, alignment and agreement with a wide range of scholars can always be difficult, as there's many valid but different points of views in terms of how zakat should be expended. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. The second element of it was balancing humanitarian need with the realities of how zakat can be spent. So how do we ensure impact and excellence in that impact while also maintaining compliance with Sharia requirements and ensuring that we're not offside in any of those specific areas? And last but not least, obviously, there are varying schools of thought. So being an international humanitarian organization serving that humanitarian purpose, what school of thought, what do our scholars advise in terms of how we proceed? How do we find that balance between all those different areas? The process actually was paused for a couple of years because scholars could not get aligned at that time, and then was re-picked up roughly around 2020, where IRW re-engaged a few scholars, and finally, alhamdulillah, did gain alignment on how to move forward. Their policy was drafted and established in 2022, which is when we adopted it, but recognizing that the Canadian context is different from the UK, and of course, our donor base, the schools of thought that they follow, how they choose to spend their zakat will be different than what exists in the UK. We actually consulted a number of scholars here in Canada and launched our own revamped policy in 2024. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, I keep talking about different schools of thought. What were the crux of these discussions about? So I wanted to highlight just a few of those wedge issues, if you will, that were a crux of the discussion that the scholars had in terms of what is permissible with zakat funding. First and foremost, the rights holders, which is our term for beneficiaries, as we know in Islam, those that are in need have a right over our wealth, and so therefore the term rights holders. First of all, the rights holders of these projects. Are the intended beneficiaries limited to Muslims or non-Muslims? And we've heard some discussions around that already. We also had deep discussions on whether zakat could fund communal aspects or whether it had to be transferred into the hands of the rights holders themselves. And last but not least, another topic that we talked about quite significantly today, overhead costs. What amount of overhead is reasonable when it comes to Islamic Relief's work? Where does the cap exist? Does a cap exist? And how much is essentially reasonable for us to take as a proportion of the zakat that's donated? And also, as a part of that, what type of costs in that overhead are eligible for zakat funding? Can we spend zakat funding on things like training, education, marketing, fundraising? The short answer is no. But also, how do we arrive at a consensus on where zakat funding can be spent? The key message in all of these is that getting alignment across various schools of thought, and of course across scholars, can be very difficult because they're all valid approaches. But for us, we recognize that as a humanitarian organization, our expertise are in humanitarian and sustainable development, not in deciding how zakat should be used. And so therefore, guidance from these scholars was essential for us to be able to move forward. Now, I'll talk a little bit about some of those challenges that I mentioned when it comes to collecting and distributing zakat. When donors give to Islamic Relief, all of us recognize that it is an incredible amana that donor is placing on us. That is perhaps the highest level of trust that a donor can have, to be able to give their zakat to you and know that it will be implemented in a way that honors that zakat and that also allows us to deliver with that ihsan that I mentioned. So that for us is paramount. And in addition to that, it's not always that simple. So in the next few slides, I'm going to cover a little bit about some practical challenges of implementing zakat and that we've actually faced and had to kind of work through in the last few years. We'll talk a little bit about balancing the preferences of the donors here in Canada with the needs of those that we serve. We'll talk about the unique challenges that are presented when you are delivering zakat funding in a disaster zone. I'll also touch a little bit more on how do you build efficiency and build high level of credibility at low cost while maintaining that low overhead. And last but not least, how do you strike that balance between donor communications that are transparent, authentic, but also easy to digest and easy to understand, especially in today's TikTok age. So let's talk a little bit about how we engage our donors first. At the core of what Islamic Relief does is this vision of a more compassionate and just world where no one is left behind. So we genuinely and strongly as Muslims believe that every human life is precious, and it's really about uplifting that life in a dignified and compassionate manner. So in practice, however, there is a continuous kind of pull between those that are in need and those that we serve, as well as our donor community here that gives to us and trusts us. From a programming lens, collecting zakat that is unrestricted. So what I mean by that is obviously it has to follow zakat guidelines, but not restricted by region, by emergency, by any type of project is ideal, because what that allows us to do is it allows us to leverage the teams that we have on the ground to tell us where the need exists and design and implement zakat eligible projects where the need exists more. However, from a fundraising lens and also from the lens of our donor community here, the reality is there are causes that are more near and dear to a lot of our donors' hearts than others. For many, sorry, just one slide back. For many, that is the locality that they're from. It might be when there is obviously an emergency happening and they really want to give to that cause. There's many reasons why donors might want to give their zakat to specific purposes. And I also want to layer this on top of the fact that about a quarter of all of our income is zakat. So that means it's not a nominal amount for us to be able to manage. So when there is additional restrictions on that funding, that does limit the type of projects that we are able to do. So really, it's about balancing that need on the ground and delivering on that need on the ground with, of course, honoring the donor intent and the communities and the causes that they care about. So the question is, what do we do about this? So our approach is really twofold. As much as possible, we encourage our donors to give. We can go to the next slide now. We do encourage our donors to give to our unrestricted general zakat pool. And this allows us to design and implement zakat projects wherever and whenever we see most fit, wherever we see the need is greatest. But we also provide donors the option to give to specific causes that we have found they care the most about. So whether that is obviously the recent genocide in Gaza, whether that was the floods, the earthquake, all of those causes strike really close to our donors' hearts. And we recognize that for many donors, zakat is their main mode of giving. They might not all have the ability to give additional sadaqah on top of that continuously. The key for us, however, is to ensure that that implementation of zakat is possible in that context. So that has to be something that we validate before even allowing zakat to go to a specific fund. So this can include considerations like, are we implementing directly through, for example, Islamic Relief Worldwide, or are we using local partners? If we are using local partners, do they have the ability, the systems, the processes, the controls in place to actually meet our zakat requirements? Or are we going to have to use non-zakat funding if we are working with that local partner specifically? It could also include things like the type of projects being considered. Is it, are we offering food packs, water, shelter, or is it something a bit more complex and nuanced that needs a more thorough evaluation? These are all considerations that we need to undertake prior to even allowing zakat funding to come into a specific fund. So what we do on our end is we monitor when we launch an emergency. If we do allow it to be zakat eligible, we monitor the amount of donations that are coming in that are checkmarked as zakat. And historically, we found that the average amount of donations for any emergency that come in that are earmarked for zakat are anywhere between 15 to 20%. You can see a tiny little case study on there. For Palestine, it was roughly 20%. And what that means is it does still allow us the flexibility to work on additional projects that may be more long-term, maybe more development, but still ensure and honor that 20% that was intended for zakat to ensure that the projects that are implemented for that amount are zakat eligible. So all the while we encourage the general zakat giving, we have still found a way to kind of maintain a balanced approach between that general zakat giving as well as that for specific campaigns. Now, speaking of emergencies, that kind of takes me to a next challenge that we faced in our work. So what does the reality of implementing zakat in a disaster zone look like? In theory, it's very simple. We collect the zakat from our donors and then we go and we hand it over to our rights holders. Alhamdulillah, all easy, all good to go. The reality, not surprisingly, not that simple. So the example that I actually wanted to share was recently from Lebanon. As we know, after the Gaza escalations, there was a lot of bombings and escalations in Lebanon as well. And for us, that was an area where our donors did express interest in donating their zakat too. So again, that whole process of the types of projects that we're doing, are we implementing directly or through a local partner? That entire evaluation was conducted. But given the context, there were two specific challenges with Lebanon in particular. Now, like I mentioned, there's varying opinions on whether or not zakat can be spent on non-Muslim rights holders. Islamic Relief's policy states, and from what our scholars have advised us, is the intended beneficiaries or the intended rights holders of our projects that are zakat are Muslims. However, in very rare circumstances where there's no other funding available and you can't differentiate as a humanitarian organization who complies with humanitarian standards, we cannot differentiate someone on the ground based on their race, religion, ethnicity, or anything of the sort. So the reality on the ground is when we are serving as a humanitarian organization, we are serving without discrimination, as it should be. So with Lebanon in particular, there were two challenges that posed themselves. First of all, Lebanon has a very diverse population. For those that may not know, about 1/3 of Lebanon's population is non-Muslim. And in addition to that, whereas typically we would be able to collect data by region in terms of the Muslim populations in certain locations, in Lebanon specifically, because of the escalations and the violence and the bombings, a majority of the population was displaced. So that means that there's no amount of data that you can gather that will practically tell you what amount of Muslims are in a certain region, how much you should be spending in a certain location, how much from other funding you should supplement. And that's the reality of the situation on the ground. The second part of this is typically for zakat eligibility to implement a zakat project, and for all of our projects really, documentation is paramount. Auditability, being able to make sure that from start to finish, the way the project is designed, the people that we have served, all of that documentation is held and maintained in our records. Again, the reality on the ground is when a majority of the population is displaced, they do not have documentation with them. They didn't flee being like, oh, let me carry my bank records and passport and all of these other items in case I'm asked by a humanitarian organization. So it's finding that balance between what is appropriate and eligible for us to be able to distribute that zakat and your donations, but in a way that is still dignified for the rights holder. So in this specific context, as you can see, there were a lot of nuances and challenges in terms of that zakat implementation. So here's how we did. So to ensure that zakat was delivered with excellence and to the intended Muslim rights holders of the region, we based our evaluation of the Muslim population on a broader scale. So instead of more of a narrow outlook of specific regions, we looked at the population in Lebanon as a whole and compared that against the percentage of donations that we saw coming in that were earmarked for zakat. Now, if you remember, I said about 15 to 20% is usually average. So if you consider that 2/3 of Lebanon's population is Muslim, the donations that we're getting, roughly 15 to 20% are earmarked for zakat. The idea is the intention behind that zakat is to serve the Muslims that are served as a part of our distributions. And as well as with documentation, finding that fine balance between what is appropriate, recognizing the needs on the ground, and recognizing that this population is displaced to ensure that we are still serving those that are truly in need, but not in a way that is unreasonable for them to be able to deliver on. This analysis really allowed us to respond to the crisis and also allowed our donors here to give their zakats to a project or an area that was near and dear to their hearts that they wanted to give to, alhamdulillah. Now I'm going to talk about the age-old question, overhead costs, all of our favorite topic when it comes to charity, universities, humanitarian organizations. I love the way Dr. Ingrid placed it, where when you are working in the way of Allah, people expect you to do it for free, but that's not the reality of how this works. The real question is, how do you deliver high impact, quality programming at low costs? And really, execution of zakat, even more so than the rest of our projects, which obviously already follow very strict humanitarian standards, requires even more diligence and even more work than our other projects. It includes appropriate staff training to understand the difference between a project that's funded from something else and a project that's funded from zakat. It requires checklists of procedures, retention of documentation, high due diligence, and more. And all of this, of course, comes at a specific cost. Is that my time?
Yep.
Oh, good, okay. I will be quick. So what does that mean? For us, really, our approach, again, is twofold. Really, one is we use unrestricted funding like sadaqah to help cover some of that overhead that we're not able to cover from zakat, which is capped at a certain percentage. But also, we continue to innovate and introduce products like allowing donors to pay their payment processing fees on top of their donation. What this allows us to do is really use donor-intended funds for overhead, and allows donors to also recognize very clearly that there is a cost to the work that we're doing. And it's a necessary cost to be able to achieve the scale and the diligence and the excellence that, alhamdulillah, we've been able to achieve. I'll touch on one very quick topic as Shaheen eyes me down. But that is really the challenge of donor communication. I hope you've taken from this conversation that the nuances and complexities of zakat are complex. And really, one of the continuous challenges that we face is in donor communication and in donor education. It's very easy in a one-on-one conversation to share these nuances, but when it comes to mass education, when it comes to mass marketing, as you saw in that first video, providing bite-sized, digestible information is key. And that's often difficult to do when it comes to a topic as complex as zakat. So our approach really is in our mass communications, we try to make our information digestible, bite-sized, easy to understand, but we are always open and willing to share more details and have those one-on-one conversations with our donors to be able to provide more context when and where they see fit. And with that, I will conclude my presentation. Jazakumullah khairan.
Thank you, Fagia. And I wasn't ironing her down so bad. I had a book. Our next speaker is Omar Yaqub. Omar serves Islamic Family, a multi-award-winning social change organization addressing systemic inequity with his 2 decades of for-benefit sector experience. He is a former historian, co-laureate for Edmonton, and past MBA instructor at the University of Alberta. He holds a Doctor of Sacred Letters and is a settler on Treaty 6. Please join me in welcoming Omar.
Assalamu alaikum. It's an incredible room. I'm preceded by 2 amazing speakers. Okay. I want to tell you a little bit about the organization I serve. I get to serve the team at Islamic Family, based in Edmonton. Some of the recognition, some of the awards we received is Imagine Canada, which is one of the gold standards for governance in Canada. We're also Great Places to Work certified, which is not common in the nonprofit sector, let alone the Muslim nonprofit sector. Some of the awards we received has been the Government of Alberta's Inspiration Award for combating domestic violence, the Canadian Mental Health Association Award for professional care, an Edify Award, an Alberta Justice Innovation Award for our work supporting people who are incarcerated, and not on here, an API Award for our work in halal affordable housing, and a YEG Startup Award for our work in innovation to benefit the larger social service sector. I say this as a humble brag because oftentimes when we think of Muslim organizations, unfortunately, we don't think of innovation and leading the way writ large for how social change can happen. Oh, okay.
It's magic.
So I want to just start by polling the room. Just quick show of hands. We've heard a few terms thrown around today. I just want to see what do people use? So when we say zakat is, how many people think a charity? Okay, no hands up. B, a wealth tax? No?
He's going back to A.
You're going back to A? Okay, good. Wealth tax? Wealth tax? Interesting. Majority is going for wealth tax. Alms or tithing? Few hands. It's beating out charity. Something else? Yeah, please.
Wherever zakat comes during the Makki era of the Quran revelation, that's charity.
Oh.
Mostly in Medina, it was already legislated as zakat becomes wealth tax.
Mashallah. Beautiful. Okay, next slide. So I'm gonna posit that there's, when we're thinking about zakat in our contemporary context, we actually have to think about some of these terminology. So when we say charity, well, what is charity? Charity is voluntary. Is zakat voluntary on a Muslim? So it makes it a little bit difficult. When we say tax, well, a tax is enforceable. And is zakat enforceable? Hmm? Yeah. Beautiful. Right? So in our contemporary context, is someone going to come and collect zakat from you? Inshallah, inshallah. Beautiful answer. But practically speaking, it's not enforceable, and so describing it as a tax has some other consternations that make it difficult. And then when we use a term like alms and tithing, we also carry the weight of those terms. So when we think about alms and tithing, those can be used to build a church. They can be used for church administration. The majority interpretation of zakat is it's not for those things. And so we really have to think about what is the term we use to describe zakat, because the existing terms actually have a little bit of baggage that we might not want to carry. And so I posit that the best way to describe zakat is economic justice. It's a direct wealth transfer. And when we think about it that way, it actually frees us up to think about its intended use in our context. And when we think about zakat, and I know there's a few speakers who will be speaking on this, it's the largest mutual aid institution in Canada, right? And oftentimes we don't think about zakat and contemporary lingo and trends in charitable giving and society. But zakat is our opportunity to lead and say, yeah, we have this institution. It's the largest mutual aid institution in Canada. It can change how Canadian society runs for the better. It's $500 million annually collected in Canada. That's a significant amount. You know, when we think about that amount, what can it be doing? What is our community strategy around zakat and what it can be used for? And so for us, we don't define ourselves as a zakat collector. There's some really interesting reasons around that. If you define yourself as a zakat collector and you use zakat to pay yourself, there's a self-dealing problem that can occur, and that's a little bit complex. You know, a historical interpretation of the zakat collector category is that it can only be appointed by the caliph, and in the absence of a caliph, it's difficult to appoint yourself, the zakat collector, and appoint your own salary, and have all these other challenges. And so we define ourselves as an agent of the poor. We don't use zakat for our administration, but even with that, there's some big thorny questions that I think are really, really important for anyone involved in zakat to answer. Now, when we think about zakat, often in Canadian society, we're thinking of it very, very simply. We think about zakat as this thing I just have to pay, and that's it. I'll just do it in Ramadan. Maybe I'll do it in the last few nights, and I'm done. But zakat's a pillar, right? And when we think about a pillar, it's like, oh, wow, this is like pillar number 3. It deserves some serious thought. It should be maybe given the same seriousness about choosing a life partner, like who do we marry, right? We don't just say, oh, hey, that's half of marriage, I'm gonna get done, end of the day. No, we spend a lot of deliberate thought thinking about, oh, what is this thing? Because it's an important part of our faith and how we navigate the world, who we navigate it with. I would say we should do the same thing. So these are 4 questions for organizations that distribute zakat. How should zakat distributors think about zakat? Its responsibility, ownerships, and the rights of those entitled to it. Number 2, how can community maximize the impact of zakat in our local community? It's really important that we collect zakat, that we try to distribute locally, but as we're collecting it locally and trying to distribute it, are we thinking about its best use, where it can change lives, who it can change lives for? We might have an inexhaustible amount of demand for zakat and a finite amount of resources, but are we thinking about where those resources can be most strategically used? Number 3, how can we balance the dignity of recipients and the diligence of stewarding community resources? These are 2 kind of like conflicting poles that should be tugging at us, right? And where do we balance? If we look at like the modalities in Canadian society, oftentimes we're skewing towards diligence. We use means testing and other ways to say, okay, this is what determines eligibility. And if we've done that, good. But historical examples are often honor-based. And what does that mean in our contemporary society when we have to work with CRA, the Canadian Revenue Agency, and others? And number 4, how can we wholeheartedly base our decision-making within the richness of our Islamic tradition? So these are 4 questions that help actually build our zakat policy. And I'll talk about some of the ways we used it. But in wrestling with these questions, this is some of the thinking that occurred for us. So dispensing zakat is an act of worship. It requires hard work. It requires developing a non-judgmental attitude and compassion. We have to think about the different life circumstances people may be coming with. One of the examples Sister Tanvir brought up was people coming in and they might not look poor. I remember a person coming to me who's a friend, and he grew up in Afghanistan. And he told me that when he grew up, he spent every dollar he got as soon as he got it, because that was the economically rational thing to do. He didn't think he was going to live past 40. And based on stats in Afghanistan, that makes sense, right? So he comes to Canada, he has to learn a whole new set of behaviors, right? And we have to consider this in how we think about zakat dispensation. We also have to really think about how are we investing in supporting those in the front line, as well as those being served. The act of helping people in our community is heavy lifting. And if we're not invested in the health of our frontline workers, in training them to think about what zakat can be used for, in training them about non-judgmental methods of working in trauma-informed care, we might be missing the mark on what we can do with zakat. Now, when we think about this charity versus justice, right? Charity is voluntary, but justice is about addressing the reasons that create poverty. And when we think about zakat and its historical uses, much of it has been not about sustaining people in poverty, but removing them from the cycle of poverty. We don't see Islamic examples of food banks. And I say this as someone who runs one of the largest food banks in Edmonton. I don't think food banks are what our tradition emulates. Who knows when the first food bank in Canada started? Anyone want to hazard a guess?
Saskatchewan.
Close.
Okay, fine.
Okay, but wait. Someone want to guess the year first?
70s,
70s?
50s,
50s? Anyone else?
80s,
80s? Is really close.
Oh.
Huh?
90s.
No, it was like 1981 in Edmonton. Right? And so we think about food banks and we think about, like, oh, this is just the way charity is done. And we think about it as like time immemorial. But it's actually a very, very modern innovation that was meant to be temporary and has become the default thought associated with charity. But if we think about food banks, what are they? Come in, show your level of deprivation, and we will sustain you in it. We see you're drowning in the water, we'll want you just to wait a little bit. When we think about Islamic examples, Umar radiallahu anhu, what he said was, when you give such that you enrich people. And historical examples are not giving people enough to eat for the day, but giving them a farm or giving them the tools to be a blacksmith. And so when we think about this element of economic justice, we have to be thinking about that. What and how can we do that with zakat? Now, in order to do that, we actually have to really rethink some of the fundamental charitable edifices that are out there. We have to think about the modern context of living in these large anonymous cities, because a lot of what enabled the early caliphs, the early Islamic leaders to give in that way was actually having tremendous knowledge of people. Not only having knowledge of the person because you saw them grow up, but maybe having knowledge of their grandfather and their great-grandfather. And there was a lot of relational capital that exists in those societies that enabled effective giving. When we think about contemporary charitable structures, they're often very transactional. And that transactional infrastructure, like come in, come out, we don't get to know you, lends itself to a suboptimal way of giving. Now, we can change that. Like we can start to say, oh, hey, we're going to invest in infrastructure that allows us to build a relationship with people. So rather than just giving someone a food hamper, we're going to register them into a financial literacy class. And maybe over the course of a few weeks in this financial literacy class, we actually learn more about them. And then instead of just giving them a food hamper, we actually learn that they need a sewing machine or they want to start a detailing business. That investment in relationships enables us to do better work. Another small example of this is just thinking about what can we do to learn who the person is. I remember a story of a woman who came to our organization. This was shared in our long-term client study. What she said to us was, I really, really appreciated the food hamper, but what I would have appreciated more was someone spending time to get to know me. Right? And if we think about ourselves, what would we want if we were in a dire situation? We wouldn't want some canned soup and some meat. We might want someone to sit down with us and help us navigate the problem. You can go back to that last slide. Yeah, so are we acting as owners or custodians? Right? A lot of zakat work happens because people think they are the owner of zakat. And really, we have to be thinking about ourselves as custodians of zakat. Zakat doesn't belong to us. Zakat belongs to the poor. It's their money. Our decisions around zakat have to be based on what they say, not what we think. The anecdote I like to use is thinking about going to someone's house. Like, let's say I went to Dr. Ingrid's house and she wasn't there, and I did a whole bunch of renos. And I put pink shag carpet on her ceiling and took out her like nice marble floor and replaced it with like linoleum. And then I said, Dr. Ingrid, don't worry about it. I used your credit card. She would be upset. Right? And we have to be thinking about zakat in that same way, right? We have to be thinking it's not ours. When we're in zakat organizations, we have to be thinking about how are the people who own zakat in charge. When we use zakat, how do we prioritize breaking cycles and giving choice within the charitable industry? And I say within the charitable industry because it adds a degree of complexity, right? CRA doesn't like organizations giving direct cash. And so we have to find creative workarounds, like doing a financial literacy class, finding ways to support relationship development, and using that to build better systems. When we think about this tug of war of dignity and diligence, we have to decide where do we want to situate ourselves, right? We have to also think about, what does contemporary society teach us and how do we come back to what our tradition teaches us? We inherit a lot of ideas in the environment we're in, and not all of those ideas are Islamic, right? Just like if we go to a buffet, we have to spend a little bit of time looking at the buffet and saying, hey, what's halal, what's not halal? And I think the same is true of charity. So, contemporary society teaches us a lot about means testing and uses interrogative methods to choose someone's eligibility, right? If we see your bank statements and we've done all of these questions, then and only then can we provide you help. Now, what might it look like when we think about using universal programs as a reference point, or using inference to determine whether someone's zakat eligible? A simple means of doing that within the Canadian context might be just asking someone, instead of asking them for their bank statement, say, hey, are you eligible for Ontario Works? And an answer to that question can actually teach you a lot. If they say no, then it's like, oh, hey, can I help you with that? And then if you're helping them with that, you open a whole bunch of doors that, frankly, are probably better than a short-term zakat fix. So those methods using inference rather than interrogation can help. We also have to be thinking about reprieve versus relief. How many of our programs are temporary fixes versus permanent relief, breaking people out of cycles of poverty? Yeah. And so when we think about this spectrum of reprieve versus relief, reprieve might be things like food bank, moving to the right, you'll see counseling, education, housing, investment, right? How do we get to a place where we know people well enough, we have enough resources that we can invest in them such that they don't need to use the institution of zakat? The goal with zakat is that the intervention you do in year one should break the cycle by year two, and year three, year two, people are paying into zakat. We have to be going into it with that method. And we have to be thinking about the people closest to us. They have priority. It's a really interesting in our contemporary Canadian society, the global environment we're in, this can be very challenging. One of the ways I think about it is no one from France is going to deliver zakat to Ontario or Alberta. The only people accountable for the people in our province, in our city, is us, right? The only people who are going to be asked about it is us. And so we have to be thinking our neighbors have a degree of rights over us. How are we fulfilling their rights? And I want to posit a question to the room. If one or two people want to answer, that'd be brilliant. If you have $1,000 and 1,000 people waiting for zakat, how do you distribute it with ihsan? Yeah. Interesting.
They can start like, I don't know, like, maybe within the self, like, so they can buy someone and then they're paying, and then they'll become the cat, like, replace with you.
Okay.
So if you give everyone $1, like, it's not really enough.
Yeah, that's brilliant. This question was the heart of our zakat policy. And it was interesting because, like, in the engagement with scholars, there was rigorous debate over this. And some said, no, you should just distribute it evenly, right? And that actually required pushback and engagement and talking about, oh, this is what we see in poverty experience and how we can break out of the cycle. So I love your answer. There's our paper we wrote on effective zakat within the Canadian context. Please feel free to download it, read it, critique it, tear it up, provide comments. We would love it. And last, if you want to engage further, you can take a picture of this. It's a QR code, and it'll sign you up for a newsletter, and we can stay in touch. Oh yeah, we can go back to the previous slide.
Getting ready for the kids.
Oh, thank you.
All right. Yeah. Keep on. So now it's time for questions. Thank you so much for your enlightening talks today. Does anyone from the in-person audience have a question? Yes. Sister Tanvir will hopefully appear on our screen.
Yeah, she will.
Okay, go ahead. Oh, sure. Okay, go ahead.
This is a question for both of you.
Raise your voice, ma'am.
Okay. Because it's like a combination, I think. But when you said that the people closest to us have priority, how do we balance that with, like, say, Islamic relief, where people are giving their zakat to, like, people abroad who also need it, because the people around them can't help. So how do we, like, think about that, and how does that play also into the discussion of, like, the centralization of zakat? Like, should you be the one to give zakat to those around you, or like the organizer? So I don't know if it's.
Great question. And actually, I think Misa slipped me a question that came in online as well, so maybe I'll try to kill two birds with one stone, although I don't know why we're killing birds. But the question was surrounding really, should zakat go to those that are physically and kin close to you versus kind of what, for example, what IFSA does is more local, what Islamic Relief does and what Faith does, it seems more local as well. What IR does is obviously a lot more global. So how do you strike that balance? And I don't know if there is a recipe or an equation for that balance. I think what it comes down to is there are varying opinions in terms of what local means. And in the global context we're in now, global can also still apply to be local. But really it's a matter of one personal preference of our donors in terms of where they choose to give to and what they consider close. Like, for my parents, if you ask them who's close to them, there's going to be their relatives in Pakistan. So it really is a matter of personal preference, but also whatever the donor trusts to give that money to. And then the second thing I'll say is it's an ecosystem. So organizations like IFSA, like Faith, are directly complementary to organizations like IR because collectively we build a system where wealth is being redistributed, not just at the local Canadian scale, but also at the global scale, because we recognize that there is economic inequality between the global north and the global south, similar to how there is income inequality between like Lauren Park and Mississauga and sitting in Malton. And so really that injustice and that inequality exists as much on the global scale as it does the local scale. So really it's about creating that global or complementary context in which all communities are able to be served. Do you want to add anything?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe I'll try to answer it by being slightly difficult. We don't need to fit everything into zakat.
That's also true.
Right? And oftentimes I find a lot of discussion is we're trying to fit the majority of things that are charitable into what is meant to be a fairly narrow category. Right? And so we can say zakat is this thing, it has these obligations for these people closest to us. Sadaqah or general charity is something vast and expansive. what we do in Sadaqah is hugely beneficial and can go anywhere and should go to the places where it's needed. I think also, there is personal preference that can be exerted, like who is local. You might have a cousin who needs zakat, and they might be in another country. And so, there isn't a clear fiqh answer on how to answer that. That's a family member, and they have obligations on you before maybe someone who's in another neighborhood. And so there's space there to answer. But what I would say is try to think about who are people who have rights over you, who are the people who no one else is benefiting, and try to support them.
In this regard, there's the local distribution and abroad. So the main rule for zakat to be distributed locally, as the Prophet when he sent Mu'ad, he said, خذ من أغنيائهم زكاة أموالهم ترد على فقرائهم. They take, the zakah of their rich people and return back to their poor people. And as you mentioned, the social justice that will never happen unless that will be distributed locally, as the right of the zakah of that money is a right for those poor people in that locality. And if anyone looking at the poor people in their locality, no poor will be in need. So we cannot put all the money in one basket and send it there. So the majority of scholars traditionally, they said you should not even transfer the zakah over the distance of qasr, unless there is an urgent need for that to save lives. So the money that has the right, not your money, is the right of those poor people in that locality, and that traditionally. Now, the final reason doesn't mean if you send it, that mean it's not count. No, it's still count, but you have not followed the rules as should be. So the poor people in that locality, that's their money. It's not the money of somebody else. Now, from the fiqh point, yes, I know my zakah could save lives somewhere else. Yes, I can send it. In that case, the priority is not because of the local and abroad. It's a local because of the urgency. That's a different, way. That's how we will look at it,
I really appreciate what you said. One thing I'd add to it is oftentimes I think our charitable giving is driven by what's in the news cycle. And letting the news cycle drive our charitable giving doesn't always allow it to get to where it's most needed. So for instance, some things in the headlines, it tends to get more giving. But where giving is often most needed internationally is often a year or two after something has happened, right? It's like, it's in the headlines right now, tons of money flowing to it. 2 years from now, no one cares. I think about Syrian refugees who have come to Canada. In 2016, there were significant dollars to support them. 2017, 2018, less and less. But that's when they actually really, really need the help, right? And that's where what our Sheikh said really applies. It's like, oh, how do we support our neighbors? Because they have rights.
Unfortunately, we're going to need to close our session, but I wanted to go to Sister Tanvir, if you wanted to add any final thoughts on what was spoken about with the previous question or anything else. Sister Tanvir.
Yes, thank you. I would agree with some of the speakers as well as the audience that if we go by what is required of us is that we should give our zakat to the local area first. That is our first responsibility. Of course, the disasters out there will hit our hearts anyway, and we will give a lot of money out there. But the zakat part, which is very restricted and is for the local, so I think we should stick with giving to the local communities.
So I'm going to have to wrap things up, unfortunately, but I'm hoping that we'll all be again together tomorrow and we can continue this conversation offline or tomorrow during our sessions.
Tomorrow, first session begins at 8:30.
Just a reminder, tomorrow's session begins at 8:30. Look forward to seeing everyone at that time.
Online.